me introduce myself. My name is Ho. H to the O-V. I used to move snowflakes by the OC. I guess even back then you can call me CEO of the ROC. Ho. Fresh out the fire.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Two Bros, One Book. I'm Lloyd.
And I'm Will.
And welcome to Two Bros, One Book. I think I said that already. This week we're talking about a slim volume called The Invisible Doctrine by George Manbiot. Is it French?
Manbiot? I think so.
Manbiot? Manbiot.
Yeah, something like that.
Manbiot sounds
Manbiot.
nice. I think both of us listened to this title as well on Audible.
Thankfully, yes. Unlike the last book, it was a little lighter, a little shorter. I really enjoyed listening to it actually on my flight to Prague.
It was nice. It was well read. I thought. Who was the reader on this one?
I think it might have been the author. Maybe it was Peter Hutchison. Might be wrong there. Sorry if I am. I believe it's one of the authors though. I think it was a collaboration between George Manbiot and Peter Hutchison. I think.
I'm looking at the title details, and yeah,
we should probably get that right. It's
read by George Monbiot, which I have to say,
okay.
You know, he has a possible future as a BBC.
His voice is
narrator.
great, right?
Yeah, he had an Attenborough quality to him. You know, a very like. And here we see on the Galapagos Islands.
It's the S's. It's the exaggeration on the hiss of the S.
Yes.
It's going to be a sad day when Attenborough leaves us, and maybe they should be getting George in on the BBC.
Yeah. I mean, I was impressed. I always like when authors read their own work because it definitely gives me. You know, a better sense of oftentimes the humor and the passion.
Well, they're reading it as it should be read, and that includes their passion, right?
Yeah, and for me, you know, this book, I felt the downside of it definitely wasn't the presentation. I thought we'll get into you know how we feel about the book after we talk a little bit more about it. But let's talk about the Invisible Doctrine. So. What is the eponymous doctrine to which this book refers?
Yes, so it's something called Neoliberalism.
It's subtitled The Secret History of Neoliberalism. Yeah. That's
right, and it's this ideology that's kind of permeated modern life, and they explain how this happened. You know, starting from colonialism through capitalism, and I personally think they did a pretty good job, actually.
Yeah, I felt, you know, it certainly doesn't go as in depth. I mean, it's clear that it's being written for very much a lay audience, which is fine. And it's being written very much as a kind of a digestible kind of a pamphlet. I would say it's more a pamphlet than a book, right?
Well, I think that was by design. I think his mission, which you know I'm quite happy with, was to expose neoliberalism and this invisible doctrine that is somewhat invisible. I mean, we all talk about capitalism all the time, right? But this has kind of gone under the radar, and I think part of this book is to expose that and make it accessible to the masses so they understand where it's come from and what it's doing.
So sort of the central conceit of this book is essentially the book picks up pretty much right around 1950 and argues that essentially following the Second World War, socialism, or the idea of essentially governments being
well, it was the kind of Keynesian policies, wasn't it?
Like, it was. Well, there's
NHS and
So the idea was that during the war period, governments got a much bigger role to play in life. The UK got the NHS. I mean, even things like, the United States got ambulance services for the first time, starting in the 1940s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. My grandfather drove a Packard ambulance in San Francisco. One of the reasons that that unified emergency services phone numbers and sort of interdependent agencies were developed was because people had them when they were in the military. And then they went, oh, this is a good idea. We should have this all the time, right? Why don't we have a number you can call for fire, a number you can call for police? Why don't we have a single dispatch for all those things? That really got started in those days. So when we talk about socialism, like today, I think it's a danger that we could go, oh, it means, something it means woke, whatever. Socialism is a very amorphous concept. Now, socialism means, having a government which is focused on social welfare, on people being, happy, healthy, and free. The idea that the government should be involved in how society develops.
And this is the stark contrast of what's described in the book with the neoliberalist agenda, where it's really capital first, free market, minimal state, freedom from taxation, and even regulations.
And capitalism had its day in the 19th century. And the horrors of capitalism was one of the reasons that socialism started to take off. Not only before the war, you had, of course, the stock market crash of 1929, and then the depression of the 1930s. You had the New Deal in the United States. You had Keynes and Keynesian economics, which is the idea that the government can play a role in creating market demand. This is the idea of induced demand, that the government can commit to spending money, and that can cause the whole economy to grow. That started to be actually applied by governments with some success. Then, of course, there was this big thing that you may have heard about called World War II. That smashed a lot of the existing systems, and as Europe was redeveloping and rewriting the social contract, people were interested in a more active role from government in shaping the economic, not only economic life, but the social life of society. And of course, the hyper-capitalists, the robber barons of the 19th century, they never really went away. They were licking their wounds, and they were looking for some way to regroup, right? And that brings us to the 1950s and this introduction, especially, Manbiot really focuses on Francis Hayek.
Yeah, Hayek, yes. Hayek. And of course, what's his name? Milton Friedman as well. Yeah.
Milton Friedman too. Even though Friedman is not always, just associated with neoliberalism, but definitely with free market capitalism. Milton Friedman famously said that corruption is government regulation of free enterprise, right? That is a form of corruption. That was his sort of thesis. But Hayek especially, and the whole Austrian school, which was a loose kind of international of economists who practice their dark art of free market capitalism in the shadows, and we're looking for opportunities to appeal. And it's important to kind of understand why socialism had a huge boon leading from the Great Depression to the end of World War II, and then why did capitalism have this resurgence, or why did specifically free market capitalism have this resurgence? And the book, I believe that Manbiot talks about this, right?
He does, yeah.
Yeah, the fact that around, in the 1950s 1950s, especially in the 1960s and 70s, you have, as governments become more socialist, as governments become more involved in economic life, you also have an increase in civil liberties, women being granted more freedom, more protections in the workforce, non-white people being granted more economic freedom, more personal and political freedom, and decolonization at the same time. So you have all these things going on that are, favoring a strong, essentially a strong state that focuses inward rather than a relatively small state that focuses outward, right? Because, Britain in some ways is a better example than the United States, right? Because the United States, following the war, almost became more colonial than it had been. But the UK decolonized following the war and became much more socialist, right?
Yeah.
And as a result, the power, the sort of zero sum power of a certain portion of the population, white males, was diminished, and that led to essentially, without putting too fine a point on it, that essentially led to this resurgence of free market capitalism, of people suddenly discovering conservatism again in the 70s and the 80s. And then you have Thatcher and Reagan and, a whole new conservative momentum. And a lot of that's just driven by plain old, woman-hating racism, right?
I found this interesting, actually, and I think Margaret Thatcher used this technique, but I don't know if you noticed in the book, I think it's perhaps towards the end, where they actually refer to almost the hero's journey. I don't know if you read that. It's the restoration. It's the restoration story.
Okay, that's so interesting. Because it was something.
Yeah, it really was.
Something that we were talking about on the last episode, right? Which was that the hero's journey is this very pro-capitalist idea, right? It's this very individualist, very
exactly.
That was something that maybe we should focus on. The Austrian school, particularly Hayek, they're focusing on it's free market capitalism, but whereas Hobbes would talk about the invisible hand of the market, the Austrian school doesn't talk as much about the invisible hand of the market. It talks about individual rational decision making, right? This is the idea that the market functions best when we all individually make rational, self-interested decisions, right? Sort of, Ayn Rand on steroids, or I guess just that's just Ayn Rand. But the idea in the Austrian school is that, each individual makes the best decisions for them, and when you put all of people's individual self-interested decisions together, you get benefits for everyone, right? Which it's interesting that those kinds of theories seem to become more popular when women and black people are getting more economic freedom. And it's
unsurprising.
Yeah. No, I mean, interesting. It is unsurprising. And certainly the connection with Marxist theory and communism and the Communist International and social liberation is a real connection. There is an obvious how should I say it? An obvious connection between the idea of a socialist state and socialism and state socialism and communism. But whereas the Communist International was a really authoritarian reactionary movement, social liberation in the West didn't particularly espouse a form of political economy, right? They weren't rabidly anti-capitalist, right? They just wanted more individual freedom and more freedom for, more importantly, groups of people. And then, so if you have people saying, well, we should let women, vote, and we should let women, get the same pay at work, or let black people vote, and then white guys are going, actually, it's all about the individual. Right? Because then now you're talking about groups, and groups, each one has to be considered. Well, we don't want each group to be considered the same, right?
Right.
So you like this book, or tell us what you thought of the book.
I liked the book. I did find it informative. I found it upset me a little. It just kind of reminded me things of kind of issues, especially in the UK. If you didn't notice, I'm from the UK. That are very close to me. I mean, obviously NHS and the kind of decline and fall, if you like, of the NHS. Which includes, he spoke a lot about the dental practices closing, which was something that we've all, if we have any UK listeners, we've all felt this. I feel like the British people will finally be fulfilling the stereotype of having bad teeth because, I mean, they're closing at an alarming rate.
I like to assume we don't have listeners. I just pretend no one's going to listen. That way I can say whatever I feel like.
Well, that's kind of the point, I think. So yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it at some level, and it resonated, and I agreed with a lot of their take on things. But yeah, it was sometimes just a bit triggering, I felt, and also I kind of lacked a bit of hope as well because, with neoliberalism, it's actually on both sides. It's on the left as well, and in my opinion, and so when you're voting in, for example, in the UK, at least, what do you do in that situation, right? He talks about incrementalism doesn't work, and you need big changes, and I just don't. Unfortunately, I don't see that on the horizon, and it's upsetting.
This was something that I wanted to bring up as well, which was, we think we are sort of tempted to assume that this is all Reaganomics and Thatcherism, right? Mm-hmm. But actually, the neoliberalism is a really totalizing ideology, because not only does it say, that we have the best answer, but it's actually saying that we have the final answer to how, commerce is supposed to go forward, how the government is supposed to function. When I listened to this book, one of the things that constantly went through my mind, it wasn't Reagan or Thatcher, it was Aaron Sorkin. It was The West Wing. You ever watched The West Wing?
Kiara has. My wife has, and I've kind of listened in, but not properly.
Mean, it's incredibly clever, but when you're watching that, you're actually being exposed to quite a great deal of a 1990s era form of propaganda in favor of neoliberalism, in favor of exactly what you're saying, incrementalism. Neoliberalism sells the idea that not only are we pretty much as free as we've ever been and are ever going to be, and not only are most of the problems solved, and not only should government not be involved in solutions, but no solution should be too extreme, right? It's radical centrism, right, which we see a ton of in American and UK politics. It's the idea that no big change is desirable, and in fact, big changes are to be mocked, are to be shunned, because they're radical, because they're for crazy people, right? And this is what the West Wing really traffics in quite a bit, is this idea of, we're very enlightened and we're very smart, and anyone who's a little bit more extreme than us, they're crazy. Right.
And this is kind of why I do really like this book, because I think it is on a mission to expose this, and maybe that's the limit of what you can do, is make people aware of actually what's going on, in the hope that people vote accordingly, if they have the chance to. But again, it's tricky when, both sides, and it seems like most political parties are aligned with this ideology.
Well, of course they are,
what do you do then?
Because who wouldn't be aligned with the idea that we need to spend? I mean, who in a position of power wouldn't be aligned with the idea that we need to spend $1 billion on every election cycle, and yet the major policy platforms of major parties, I'm talking about in the US, but it's very similar in the UK, should basically be nothing should change. Literally,
Right.
they're arguing over what color of the deck chairs should be on the Titanic, and
Right.
and this book is talking about climate change. And it's talking about the fact that there aren't going to be there isn't going to be a stable international system to protect if we continue on the way that we are. And neoliberalism says not only is it okay to continue on, but it's absolutely a moral imperative to continue on exactly as we are, not to change things. And look at the long-term results of the it's sometimes called the Washington Consensus. This is the 1990s idea that the Cold War was over. We're going to have a big peace dividend. We're going to privatize everything, and we're all going to be richer, right? And what happened?
The rich got even richer, and the poor have got poorer. The gap has widened, essentially.
Yeah, the gap has widened while certain narrow indicators for wealth, like access to clean water or entertainment.
I mean, that's bullshit. That's bullshit, though, right? It's like getting a property in London, for example, is prohibitive. You can't.
Yeah.
That's a need. If there's 5 needs, that's got to be one of them. And you just can't do it now. And even renting.
Yeah, and neoliberalism would say, yeah, but you can have an iPhone.
Okay, that's fine then. No worries. Yes. I'll just learn a degree. Yeah, sure.
And look at what the Washington Consensus actually brought on the world system. Look at the major conflicts of today. You have a genocide going on in Palestine. You have something of an attempted genocide in Ukraine. You have Russia, which was ravaged by neoliberalism. People don't realize this. In the 1990s, the Russians, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the American response to that was to send a bunch of essentially finance bros to Moscow to privatize huge, massive, and potentially multi-trillion-dollar businesses for peanuts. Practically, they encouraged the government to practically give away these companies. And we're talking about, it's not only the things we know about, like Gazprom and the energy companies, but things like the vodka production companies. Did you know this?
I didn't.
So it's one of the most important industries in Russia is vodka production. And as a result of privatization, it fell into the hands of oligarchs. And it was one of the first things that Putin, when he became president in Russia, got his personal control over was the vodka production. It's like the key to power in Russia and has been for centuries. But it was privatized, just thrown out the window to whoever was standing on the pavement. In service of the idea that, as long as it's in private hands, it's definitely going to be better taken care of. So really the jewels of the empire just being thrown away. And that was the Washington Consensus. And the result was, first of all, famine and horrible political instability, and then authoritarian rule, and then finally, war of conquest. So that's been the result. And the result in Israel, Palestine is quite similar. The fact that the ruling class there, the ruling parties are neoliberal, uh, allows them to give the excuse that every, the settler communities are self-directed, that they're not, that they shouldn't be cracked down upon by the government, right? So it allows the government sort of a plausible deniability to say, well, we can't control people, right? And this um, this obsession with personal responsibility is so, we've talked about this, you and I, so many times. I've driven Uber off and on for years, and I even drive Americans sometimes in Prague, and it's something that they'll ask me, like, I'm looking around and like, where are all your drug addicts and your homeless? And I'm like, well, we don't have a lot of drug addicts or homeless here because, we have some, but they're not, on every street corner here.
I mean, let's be real, compared with the US.
No, compared with where I'm from, San Francisco, nothing.
Yeah.
And they'll ask, kind of, well, why not? And I'm like, well, because we have socialism here, and we don't think that people should live on the streets.
Could you tell me a bit more actually about the political parties and structure in Czech Republic? I live here, and it's a shame, but I don't know much about it.
It is still dogged by by centrism, by neoliberalism, but it's still at the base a much more socialist.
Yeah, the culture is, right.
Well, and it's a funny thing because it's a very hard thing to describe to Brits or Americans, because I can say in one breath it's a very socialist country, and in the next breath a very conservative country. Right? So how does that work, right? Because here, conservatism is not neoliberalism. Conservatism is the opposite. Conservatism is socialism, because socialism was the totalizing ideology for 60 years, well, nearly, say 50 years. Anything that departs from socialism, including privatization, is necessarily suspect, right?
So with conservatism, you mean the kind of more on the side of just, I guess, careful spending and things like that, as opposed to the individual. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So it's not very spendthrift. They don't want to spend huge amounts of money, especially through deficit spending. They don't want to borrow, which can be a problem sometimes because, not being willing to borrow actually gets in the way of some Keynesian economics, right? Of, the government actually being able to manage or induce demand. But on the other hand, there are certain of those third rails that no one will touch. And here, universal medicine, universal education, including tertiary education, and many other basic things, what we consider to be basic, are not to be messed with, right? So universal healthcare is sort of taken for granted. A very safe society. We also have had, and I would say it's more and more been privatized, but we have had also pretty near universal housing, and that comes from cities and local councils owning tons of the real estate, following the.
And as far as I'm aware, the income tax, I think, is around 20% in the Czech Republic. How do they manage that? Because it's very evident where that spending goes, but being a Londoner for most of my life, it's really not evident. There's potholes in the roads. I mean, I don't need to list the issues we have, but
I mean, I'm not an economist, so I'll probably give you a half-educated sort of guess. I would say, for one thing, I mean, we garner much more income for the government from sales tax, which that's also true in the UK. We don't have as big a military. So, you know,
Right.
if you don't have to pay for nukes and aircraft carriers and frigates, and, you know, we don't even have a navy, right?
Hmm.
So that might tend to make it seem like, you know, every life is much easier because we don't have to spend nearly as much on a huge military.
Mm.
That's certainly one. Where else does it come from? I mean, the marginal taxes for the super rich are very high, right?
Hmm.
That's part of it. Um, but you know,
That's the way it should be.
yeah, but the taxes for me, like as an entrepreneur, like if I make less than 50,000 euros a month, basically, my effective tax rate, and I'm including health insurance, is like under 10%. You
Mm.
know, that's kind of
And,
amazing.
and the ROI for that is evident in my opinion.
Oh,
So
certainly.
let's talk about America.
Yeah.
Obviously elections. We're talking about
Oh, but by the way,
neoliberalism. Obviously, that's.
I wanted to
Mhm.
say that there are some savings implied in all of that, right? If you have a universal healthcare system, that actually saves you money. If you have universal housing, that actually saves you money, right? Because your
Sure.
police don't cost as much.
In
Your
the long term, absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Your cities don't cost as much because you don't need to have militarized police, right? I mean, in the United States right now, one of the reasons that taxes have crept up so high while having, and same in the UK, while having less and less seeming benefit to the population, is you have militarized police and you have.
Well, a lot of these strategies and policies are quite short-sighted. It's like in a business where, often the sides of marketing, for example, that get measured are simply measured because they're the easiest thing to measure,
Yeah.
when in fact they're not necessarily the most strategic thing to measure that has best returns. And I think that's across the board, and we see that in policy even where there's just short wins, across their term. And just measuring things that are convenient to measure that actually, may or may not indirectly have an impact.
Yeah, and there is no substitute for. I mean, the you know it needs to be stated, just to be fair and to be clear. This is not the same kind of society as the UK or the US. This is not an immigrant society.
Mm.
It's not a very racially diverse country comparatively, and that does not. I'm not saying that racial diversity leads to poverty. I don't think that's true. In fact, the opposite. But it but immigrant societies have a great deal of inequality, and inequality leads to certain kinds of instability, right? It leads to certain
Mm.
kinds of um, certain kinds of attitudes towards government, and I don't mean from the immigrants or from the non-white people, very often from the white people, right? So
Mm.
countries that have a large amount of immigration, they also tend to have much more dynamic conservative movements in response to
Mm.
that, right? So in fact, like racism makes them in some way more sclerotic as socialist states because uh, for reasons of racism, people don't want the government to spend money, right? They don't want the
Mm.
government to spend money on educating and housing and treating people who are not like them. And that leads to more inequality, which leads to, more crime, and more conservatism. So, maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe it does all go
Mm.
back to that, which is like, as soon as you give people equal rights, then there's going to be people who go, well, hang on, I was preferenced before, I was privileged before, and now I'm a little bit less privileged, and
Mm.
at what cost, right? To them, that's like, well, I've lost a little bit of status. But go on, you were saying
Mm.
about the U.S.
Well, I just, with the elections upcoming, obviously it's a part of the world that has been very much a part of the neoliberalist story.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I mean, you're obviously from the US, so I'm just interested to hear what your opinion is for, I guess, the next, potentially next 4 years,
Oh, yeah.
for your homeland.
it's confusing, because it's like we were talking about earlier. There is no progressive movement anymore. There is no socialist movement. Kamala Harris was a prosecutor in California. I mean, she was locking up people who were, getting caught with a nickel bag of crack for 10 years. Sending them, on life sentences for 3-strike laws. It's 3 strikes. So it's the idea of
I know, yeah.
somebody gets arrested for stealing a pack of gum, and because they went to prison 10 years ago, now they're going to get a life sentence.
Yeah.
She was doing that kind of, and she can say, yeah, I was following the law and the policies, but she was a part of that apparatus. You don't have to do that. Right? Nobody makes you do that as a job. And she was the attorney general of a very regressive state. California is not a progressive place. It masquerades.
It's often depicted as a very progressive state.
Because in America, being progressive means you just say nice things about gay people. You just say, "Oh, love is love," and it's like, "Oh, good, love is love." It's like it doesn't. It's completely.
They almost kind of piggyback trends and popular culture to push neoliberalist agendas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they want because that is what it is. The Democratic Party is for. Oh, I had the perfect word for it. Now I can't remember. It is for essentially counterfeiting conservative politics, counterfeiting or smuggling these pernicious ideas about individual responsibility into American actual progressive movements, so that saying, oh, we're the party of gay people, we're the party of trans, or we're the party of, black Americans, which is like, yeah, you are, because they'll vote for you instead of voting for the guy that literally says that he wants to make it illegal, which is like, well, that's, Sophie's choice. Like, well, what's the...
And it kind of, it really frustrates me because it almost makes me feel like we don't really have a democratic vote, because the data and the agendas we're being served are not reality.
No, yeah,
and that's not just from governments, right? That's from, if you're using X Twitter, I mean, these days, I mean, it's totally right wing. Like, it's, the kind of stuff you're going to be served there has that agenda. And
so
if people are voting with other, with people who have a voice who shouldn't have a voice, with essentially, let's call it data that is, untrue, misinformed, then it's not a democratic vote in a way.
Oh yeah. But I mean, it's also not a democratic vote, and we're talking about democracy in the sense of being popular, right? Of being based upon the popular will, right? It's also not very democratic when you essentially have a policy consensus that drives all of your national politics, and then within that consensus, you then have two wings, two parties. But essentially, they're just little cosmetic changes to a base, of which is neoliberalism.
And the Constitution really actually kind of promotes individualism and neoliberalism in a way.
It absolutely does, and not surprisingly, right? Because it was written by a bunch of slaveholding, freehold landlords. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? Why it would be like that, and the Constitution also makes itself very hard to change. And it's easier now than it was at the beginning, and it was not easy at the beginning.
So what's changed in recent years in the Constitution? When I say recent years, the past few decades.
Well, nothing.
I didn't think so. Yeah.
That's your answer. Nothing. There hasn't been a change to the Constitution since 1980.
I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah,
that's absolutely crazy.
It's
if you think about the change
it's now the longest time that the Constitution has gone unchanged
wow.
in American history. Yeah,
That's scary.
Yeah, but so what I was saying, I think, you know, California. I'm from California, and it's this sort of worst of all worlds kind of place where you have a really neoliberal economic agenda, and then you have also on top of that a sort of very surface level lip service to progressivism that doesn't actually, you know, accomplish very much. And you really have no I don't know. There is no because the Democratic Party is the single, you know, party in charge of the state and is going to remain. You really have no dynamic opposition to it. So you don't have people going, well, actually, the consensus of the way that we do things is all screwed up, and we shouldn't do it this way. You know, we should actually, you know, I'm, believe it or not, in favor of raising taxes in California even more, but on the super rich, which is the last thing that the consensus would want to do, right? But if we were so, that's what I ask people, like, if we're so progressive, why do we have hundreds of thousands of homeless, you know, living on the streets? Why? That doesn't make sense. Why do we have, you know?
Well, and in the same state, the richest people in the world as well.
Yeah.
In fact, the same city where you're from, Lloyd. I mean, we went there last time I was there, maybe 6 months ago or something like that. And it's just shocking. You drive through past some of the biggest houses, most amazing houses you've ever seen. And then in the actual city, it's honestly like a post-apocalypse zombie scenario. It's scary.
And San Francisco has a long history of busting up and disrupting any kind of grassroots social change. You know, going back all the way to the big earthquake in 1906, it has a long history of taking grassroots social developments, soup kitchens, homeless shelters, free libraries, needle exchanges, gay clubs, you know, on and on and on, and disrupting and destroying them because they threaten the power base of the city fathers, and that's just San Francisco. But California as a whole has that same problem. It has a huge, very lucrative political machinery, and you know, any kind of grassroots, any kind of small scale anything disrupts that, right? It disrupts you know, the spice must flow, like that. And that's what being an American is you get, you know, the second they want Trump to be the opposition, because, you know, when Trump says, oh, you know, we're gonna turn gay people into dog food tomorrow, then Nancy Pelosi can send an email within an hour to 50 million people asking them for money, right? And that's exactly what will happen. You know, and I'm not, by the way, like, I'm not both sidesing, right? One of those is infinitely worse than the other, but neither one is actually working for the benefit of the people, right? So meanwhile, nobody does that, you know. Whereas here, I feel like, yeah, maybe in Czechia, it's a smaller country. People do feel that the government is a little more answerable to them. I mean, Czechs can complain all day about politics, but actually they're pretty spoiled because the government tends to respond to what people actually want. You know, it's not big enough to be corrupt enough, right? So people can make more money in the private sector, so that's what they do.
And it really doesn't seem to be an oppressed place to me. You know, it seems like people are happy here, and unfortunately, I can't say the same these days about the UK.
Yeah,
at least in my experience.
So you asked. So what about the UK? I mean, you just voted in a Labour government for the first time in like practically our lives. So no, not
Well,
that.
we have Blair. We had Tony Blair for 2 terms, and for me, it's
Tony
kind of a
Blair, Tony
repeat.
Blair is the poster boy for neoliberalism, and
Well,
yeah,
but so is Karma. So
right.
it's I'm not optimistic.
So what would you
You
say?
know,
So this is something that from an outsider I didn't understand, which was why through all the travails of, you had prime minister after prime minister for the last like decade, just completely. I mean, like they would at one point it felt like you announce a prime minister, they walk on stage, they slip on a banana peel, they say the N word, and then by the time they're off the stage, they're fired by tweet or whatever. Like it seemed like
well, do you remember Liz Truss and her? I mean, that was
no, I don't, because it was too
neoliberalism
short.
on steroids.
It was too short,
Right.
right? It was like, yeah, exactly. Like Liz Truss was like that was like a dog that caught the car. My God, like talk about neoliberalism, right? She came in and she was like, "We're gonna privatize everything," and the
Yeah.
financial markets went, killed, just
They
basically
went
jumped
pear
off the
shaped
cliff.
overnight.
And then she was out by,
I mean, we've been a laughing stock for years, Lloyd. I mean,
but
obviously Liz Truss,
why did you have election?
Johnson.
So why did you have election after election? You had Johnson. You had even before that, like Theresa May. Like I'm sorry, like
Theresa May running through the cornfields.
she ran a snap election and then lost more of her majority than she'd already had, and yet the people still voted Tory, and they still voted like 2 or 3 more times since then, right? So what's going on?
Sure. Hard for me to answer, honestly. I don't know. I think it's probably a bit of what we were talking about earlier. I think it is somewhat an individualist country. If I were to compare Italy, for example, which is where my wife's family are from originally, there's a lot more of a collective culture there. People look out for each other. There's community. And that's it. There's not so much of that in the UK. It's interesting though, actually, that there is outside of London, but ironically, it's the Londoners that voted for Remain over Brexit.
But I mean,
so it's all very confusing.
One could argue that, I mean, that in a way, Remain was the neoliberal response, right? I can say I would have been in favor of Remain as well, but not probably for the same reasons as many people were. But,
well, is it neoliberal because there are EU policies that protect us, right? For example, you compare let's say a Czech McDonald's to an American McDonald's, you can taste it's legit, right? And that's EU policy.
Well, yes, I mean, but you could also argue that the Little Englanders, that's not a it's not purely a conservative versus progressive sort of divide, right? There's there is something to, like we were just talking about. Czechia is a small country, and there's a part of the Leave movement. I don't think a very vocal or a very well informed part that was probably thinking the same thing. They were probably thinking, well, if we're not involved in the EU, then we can take care of our own problems, which would be good because we have problems. And I'm sure that there were people that went in thinking that somehow, even though they were not right, and even though the outcome is not going to match their hopes. I think if I have to try to understand why people voted Leave, I think there's something to that as well, which is like,
I think I would like to think there could be that, and there could be an argument. It's perhaps not as democratic. We don't vote for those EU policies in the same way. We do have a representative, of course, but it's not so direct.
That's what I mean, because the book talks a lot about this, right? It says that actually, neoliberalism, one of the key features is that it's not democratic, that it's bureaucratic. And the
Sure.
EU is very bureaucratic and not very
Yeah,
democratic.
that's a point. That's a good point. I think that's true, and I think that could be an argument. The problem is, though, is actually that isn't the reality in the UK. The reality is that there are racists and there are horrible people who are voting, and those were the people who were voting. It seems, at least, those were the people who were voting to leave, or at least that's what
I agree,
you
and
know.
maybe that explains for us why the Londoners were voting for stay, even though
I think so.
it may
Yeah,
have it
I
may
think
have
so.
just been like we're not with the racists,
And
right?
I think this all comes from uh, actually neoliberalism over a long period of time, where we've become so individualist that it's atomized us to the point where we're not blaming the people at the top anymore. We're blaming our neighbors. We're blaming people who live near us, who are fighting for survival, frankly,
Yeah.
in London. When actually we should be looking up and thinking, okay, why are we fighting each other? And having a sense of community and coming together. We spoke about incrementalism, and it's not going to work voting for Labour. I
No.
mean, it's a step in the right direction, perhaps, but it won't work. So I think
No, because
there needs to be drastic change, and that happens through community and information, true information,
yeah.
and coming together and protesting and forcing change.
It's obvious that, I mean, Labour also helped get the UK where it is now. So it's not like,
Sure.
it's not like they've been, against neoliberalism from the start. They had Tony Blair. Like they've been, and
Sure.
they've been following along. They've been dancing to America's tune for decades.
Of course.
And copying all of their worst all of their worst policies.
Quite literally
Yeah.
copy and paste.
Copy and
It's
paste.
cringe.
It is, and yeah, I mean,
And what do you do when you have both sides? I mean, I've historically voted Green Party a number of times.
yeah.
Which a great sentiment, but it doesn't seem to help. It doesn't seem to do anything.
Well,
So
I've been proverbially screamed at over and over for stating, and I don't mind stating it here, that I don't plan to vote in the election.
we discussed this, Lloyd, and I'm the same. So
I know you are, but very few people are. And then they'll go, "Oh, well, you're voting for
yeah,
Trump," and I go like, "Well, no, I'm not actually, because I'm, voting for Trump would be voting for Trump, which I'm not doing. But I'm not going to vote, for someone whose policies I don't agree with. That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem consistent with the political values that America is supposed to claims to have, right? Which is that we provide some kind of popular legitimacy to the government by voting for them. So if you don't vote, that is withdrawing some amount of the popular legitimacy of your leaders, right? Because on election day, one of them is going to stand up and say 80 million people voted for me, right? And that's going to, give them comfort and succor in, pursuing the policies that they're going to pursue. And I'm not, I have yet to see a mainstream candidate in my lifetime that.
I mean, like at the end of the day, if a lot of people didn't vote, they hit the streets protesting about the fact that they weren't being represented. Guess what? That plants a seed, and there might be a group of people that actually respond to that.
And what happened? And what happened when not even a lot of people, but a few Democrats said, actually, I don't support Biden. He left the race in like a month. When a few prominent members of the party said, actually, this is not a good idea. So like, yeah, it doesn't actually take as much as people think.
I think George, the authors in Invisible Doctrine, they actually gave a number. I'm not sure where they got this from, but if I remember correctly, speaking of incrementalism, they were saying actually if there's 25% of a population, only 25% who are prepared to change, the rest will follow.
Oh yeah. Well, I think
And
they were.
that's very powerful.
I think they were. It might not. It might be a little darker than you're thinking, but I think it was like National Socialism, right? It was
Sure.
famously like it was about 25% of the population that voted for the Nazis. And that,
Oh,
was
was it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know
Okay.
if that's what he was referring to, but it is an interesting point, which is a true point that actually, the idea of popular legitimacy, it's a few less than
Well,
what people generally think.
it's how you reverse social norms, I think, as you put it. If you can get 25%, and that's enough for other people to follow suit.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, also I think he was talking about this, about there was a lot of research in the 1960s and 70s into crowd psychology. And
Hmm.
there were some studies that, and I'll have to put a link or something in the description. There were some studies that suggested or claimed that basically if you could get about 5% of a population to participate in a protest movement, 5%, that is enough to topple a government.
Wow.
Right? It's small. Well, I mean, 5% is small, but then again, it's not. How many people is 5%? In America, that's like
Um,
7 million people.
I think it's more, right? It's like 20 or something.
Am I
I
doing
don't
the
know.
math here? No, you're right. God, what am I thinking? 330 million. So that's, yeah, you're right. That's like 15 million people, 16,
Yeah,
17 million people. If you can get 16 million people to participate in a protest movement, that's a lot of people. If you think about it like that,
it's a lot of people. Yeah.
it is a lot of people, but it's only 5%.
Mm,
25%. I mean, yeah, there you're talking about 60, 70 million people, which is pretty much how many people vote for each of the major parties now.
sure.
So, yeah, so the future is being decided by a small number relatively. But
Mm,
but I agree. And that's like what Noam Chomsky says. Like when I always loved his responses when people talk about things like, oh, what about this? He gives these talks and people always bring up 9/11 truther, conspiracy theories.
sure.
And he goes and his response to it is great, where he just goes, oh, well, I say more power to you, and you should write a paper and you should try to get it published in a journal.
Hmm.
Like, oh, structural engineers for 9/11 truth, and he's like, why haven't I seen their research in popular
Right.
mechanics? Like, why haven't I? Oh, and he's like, I've read for journals. How come I haven't seen any of these papers being submitted? Yeah,
Mm.
submit them. I mean, and
It's like the Cunning-Kruger, isn't it? It's like someone reads a book and suddenly they're an expert on a topic and everything is not what it seems, right? Mm.
well, and I guess his response to any popular movement, supposedly popular movement, and he says like, yeah, I understand that you've got 500 people to sign a petition, but can you get 500 people to write a paper? Can you get 500 people
Sure,
to show up, for a
sure,
conference?
sure.
Because that's how you get things done, not the signing the petition, right? It's not change.org, right? You're not gonna get it with signatures. You're gonna get it with the next thing. What's the next thing?
Mm.
The bigger thing. And it could be anything, but as long as it's bigger than that. Because
Sure.
signing your name is the smallest thing possible. So,
Mm.
yeah, I was not that much interested in it anymore. I realized that people kept telling me every election was the most important election of my life, and I sort of went, well, they can't all be, right? They
Mm.
can't all be. One of them has to be less. So, but nobody ever wants to tell you, well, this election's pretty important, not as big as last time.
Yeah. And voting isn't the only way that you get return on having those ideologies, actually. I think day to day, living by those more socialist ideologies actually make you happier. So
Absolutely.
it's not just the vote.
Raise your
Yeah,
kids, raise your kids properly.
right,
Talk
exactly.
talk to your neighbors. I don't know, take out the trash. Little things.
It's all about community, guys. It's all
Yeah.
about community.
But you can do a lot of good for a lot of people. It doesn't take much, and it can be anything. Like it can be anything. You know me. Like I'm not a huge political activist, but I'm constantly at least talking. I'm at least trying to engage.
Yeah.
And talking about it with my friends. Right? I think like it's interesting because I think for you, for example, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't think this would have been your cup of tea. This kind of book.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And this is, politics isn't an area that I've enjoyed historically speaking about, actually. I found that it was one of those topics where people always thought they knew the truth and would speak with full conviction about what they were talking about. And then I would go away and read a book about that topic and realize that they had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of people talk shit in politics. And so over the years, as I've kind of become better read in the area, I've actually enjoyed it more.
Well, that tends to be the reality, right? If you put more into it, then you will get more out. That's
Well, and I think, as we were saying, it actually helps you live a better life, as cliche as it sounds. It actually does. And being more aware.
I don't mind if it's cliche, if it's true, yeah. I mean, I think for me, yeah, once I started to realize that, like, oh, it's okay to have, very specific beliefs, and it's okay to, to talk about them, especially, if you talk about them with the appropriate amount of respect for the fact that, you're not a specialist,
Yeah, and the thing is, the other thing I have come to realize through empathy is everyone has their story. And actually, I've known people who have really had hard lives, and they're full-on capitalists, right? And some of the most charitable people I know are also capitalists. So, not judging, but the kind of...
I noticed that. I was gonna say I noticed that a lot of people that have had hard lives are, and you have to at least you do have to appreciate why, right? Because it does make sense. It's someone who has made a success of their lives, despite a lot of tribulations. Of course, they're going to gravitate to ideas.
Well, and they'll attribute the fact that anyone can do it if they can, and that's a bit of a trap, actually. It's a bit of the hero's journey thing coming out there, because it's not true. Like, it's just not true.
Well, the fact is that most people won't, whether they can.
Exactly.
Maybe they can, but they won't. So we can be concerned with the people that don't, or we can blame them. I think maybe that's, and maybe it's someone like me coming from a much more privileged background. It's easier for me to, in some way, admit that I didn't do it all myself. I think it's people who are a little bit insecure about it, who they tend to go hard for capitalism because,
Sure.
Yeah, but.
Or even someone with great pride, or just someone who's not read much about it and has kind of gone with the flow and it's worked for them. There's so many reasons, and
I mean, these people I understand. I think the people that I don't understand, or let's say the people who I don't have much empathy for, are people who were born and raised privileged and are capitalist, hyper-capitalist shitheads. I don't get that.
Dude, there's a lot of them.
I don't get that. I don't get it. 'Cause I just don't get it. It's like if I was born in a city with a baseball team, let's say, New York, right? The Yankees. And I had a baseball team that won 70 out of the last 100, World Series, which is like pretty much the case. I don't think it's 70, but it's a huge number, like a ludicrous number. And you have fans in New York who are like, oh yeah, I love the Yankees, and it's like, I don't get that. I don't get it, because...
You know what's funny? You remind me of something. I think my best man said this at my wedding recently.
Right.
And he said, you've married a Tottenham fan. Tottenham is a football team in the UK. They're not a very successful football team.
Right.
And he said that's the key. is that you know he's loyal because he still turns up, even though they failed for the past 30 years. He's still an avid fan. So
Yeah, I mean, there's something about being. It's like the kids that I grew up with. This is a very American reference, but I'm from San Francisco. There were kids that wore Dallas Cowboys outfit, jerseys and stuff. And if you know the era and you know the teams, like this is the similar thing to the Yankees. It's sort of like they're latching on to perceived glamour and success, and no loyalty. So I don't get that. It's fine. I guess it's fine if you're from New York or if you're from Dallas, then it's like
sure.
you don't really have a choice. Although New York, they do have a loser team, and that's the Mets, and I think that's more respectable. But fair enough. That's fine. But if you're like from San Francisco and you're rooting for one of those teams,
Well, I think you use teams interestingly here because actually political parties can be tribal in a way, like football teams are. And
of
obviously,
course.
hooliganism is very it's crazy still in the UK. Actually, a lot of Europe, in fact. But that level of tribalism and kind of hostility between each other is actually in individuals and their political parties. And again, these people are misinformed. They have really strong opinions about the Conservative Party,
Right.
and they'll be arguing with someone who's pro-Labour, and they actually don't know what they're talking about. They're just tribal.
Right. Right. Well, that's a huge part of it. I mean, obviously. Yeah, and especially as we're talking about the fact that actually under sort of a neoliberal aegis, like essentially these two tribes are not actually that different from each other. They are different, and they are different in the superficial ways that they are different or very pronounced.
But it can still show someone's colours to an extent because,
Sure.
there's this invisible doctrine, and it's called that for a reason. But some people who side with, let's say, the more progressive side, they do genuinely want that. They might not realize that there's a level of deceit, but they do want it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like I
They
get
have the desire.
I get people who are like, oh, what are you gonna become a Trumper? When I say I'm not voting for Democrats, and it's like, no, there's like, really, why are those the choices? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I want someone that'll give us free healthcare. You know what I mean? And I understand it's not free, but universal healthcare, right? I mean, that's what I want. Why can't we have that when it's popular? That's the crazy thing. So back to the book quickly. My criticisms of it are pretty short, I would say. It's not so in depth or detailed. It's pretty short, right? It's like 4 hours listening time, so it couldn't have been more than 100 pages, 120 pages. So a pamphlet length, basically. It's not very detailed. It's not as informed about political economy as something like, if you know Mark Blythe, do you know the name? He's a political economist, professor at Harvard, I think, and he wrote a book called Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea. You ever heard of him?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book. I'd suggest that we read it.
I haven't read it, though.
I'd suggest that we read it, but our rule is that we can't have read it already. And it's a fantastic book. If you like this book, then you'll really like that book because it's much more.
Okay.
It's much more technical, but it talks about financial markets and about the way that governments project their budgets and the way that they understand their influence on the economy. It's really interesting.
Can we also, could you just plug Winner Takes All as well? I think, again, we've read that, so it probably won't be.
Winners Take All. I think it's Behind the Elite Charade of Changing the World by Anand Giridharadas. God, I said it correctly.
Well done.
Who was a columnist for the New York Times. That's another fantastic book. Also about neoliberalism, and he does it more from the side of the tech business. or from business elites, and also from the media. That's a book about the Davos set, sort of essentially promulgating neoliberalism via feel good kind of content.
Yeah, it's honestly, parts of it are mind blowing. It's great.
It's quite, that's, if you talk about like depressing books though, I mean, yeah, I think that book, I told you, that book changed my career because I read it and I realized I couldn't work in venture capital anymore. Couldn't do it.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
I had to do something else, and I did. And, I feel, a book like that, it has a special place in my heart. It's not as timeless. It's not going to be probably a timeless book, but it's a fantastic book. And you haven't even finished it yet. You didn't want to keep going.
I told you I found it really depressing. Actually, I promise I will. I did really enjoy what I read. I just found it hit home, and even Invisible Doctrine. As I said, at times I found it quite hard to get through.
It's especially if you have to, sort of hold your stomach and go, oh, I've actually said those things. Like, oh, I've actually poo-pooed the idea of radical change.
And as as you said earlier, I mean, it wasn't so long ago where I was very much driven by the promise of capitalism. I've worked in startups for I guess over 10 years now, and so there's a bit of a gag reflex there, honestly, looking back.
And especially,
but we're growing, right? We're growing, and that's why we're reading these books.
I think it's admirable for you because like you're someone who's had not only like is in that world but has been successful at it. To be willing to say, oh, hang on, maybe actually, my success, while good for me, isn't necessarily good for everybody. In every in every way. You try to do your best, but it's like if you're working under a system that doesn't care if it's your best or not, because it's going to do what it does, then change requires more than just doing well to do good, right? There's that, or is it doing good to do well? I can never remember. That's like a very Washington thing. Like there's do good to do well, or do well to do good, right? So my other criticisms of the book, it's quite cursory. It gives a very cursory history of the economic and philosophical sort of topics. So it's not going to give people a really strong grounding. And I think potentially it doesn't give enough of a framework for people intellectually to understand what neoliberalism actually is about and how it manifests. And I would say more historical examples would be good. Maybe more articles specifically about different countries and different parts of history. It's very focused on the UK. It's very focused on the here and now, which is fine, talking about climate change. But I felt like it could be, I mean, it can always be more, but it could easily have been 4 times longer.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It kind of, there were quite a few sweeping statements. I think it talks about structural adjustment policies and things like that. It doesn't really go into actual details, which I would have quite liked. I share the same opinion as you. I think, yes, there could have been probably some more details and use cases, sources, but I think if the mission here by the authors was to kind of get the word out to the masses, as opposed to those who are just interested in, because I would recommend this book to people who are not politically inclined, and I think it would be accessible, and if that's their mission, then actually I think that's part of the design here, and kudos. Yeah,
it's fine. I think I agree, because winners take all, that's like something that, I don't think, I'm not sure if my mom would read it, I think she actually did read that book, but I'm sure that she would read something like this, and that it would be much more, much more digestible. And then you have those longer economic and business books that are available in this subject matter, and Amazon, ironically enough, is good at is good at promoting those once you've read, one of them. So there you go. Something capitalism is doing right, I guess. Like
to its own detriment, let's hope.
we give out about it, but it's like, I mean, people will say, "Oh, you're against, having these modern conveniences," and it's like, no, not at all. Those are great. It's just that, the price, if the price is like, our future, then it's too high, right? The price has to be lower, right? It just has to be.
Yeah, I mean, public luxury is possible. Economically, it's possible.
That's a good line from the book that I wish I'd noted down. I think I did take note of it when I read it, but exactly right. He makes this delineation, right? He talks about private luxury and public poverty. And
Yes.
he talks about how we can actually have public luxury, right?
And we can. We definitely can.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think he brought up the point of how the moment that schools in southern United States were integrated, suddenly every town and county was able to build a private school and a well-funded one. So that meant the money was always there to build a much better school. They just didn't do it. Right. And then the second that they realized that black people might enjoy public funds, they cut public funds, and they wanted to privatize everything. So public luxury means, things like free healthcare. It's like people always say, some of the best medical technology and the best hospitals in the world are in the U.S. And it's like, private ones, that's the problem. It's like, we have all the hospitals and the technology and all the doctors and all the universities, but they're all private,
it's literally the same thing as I don't know, Sam Altman with his $5 million supercar or whatever it is. It's only for them.
Yeah. And even the public institutions are run as if they are private. So that's, the image that I like to give people of the Bay Area and to what degree this is true, right? San Jose, there's a specific zip code, where, it has the highest median income in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because this is where people like, Sergey Brin and Larry Page and a bunch of other people live. So you're talking about, median wealth of, tens of millions of dollars or whatever it is. And during the financial crisis, the recent one, so 2009, 2010, the public library there had to go to 3-day weeks, right?
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
The public library.
Did you I think it was Gordon Brown who's recently been talking about having library of things, where instead of just having library of books, it's library of anything that is useful but kind of pointless to own, like I don't know, like a hedge trimmer or
that's nice.
Something like that.
That's a nice idea. That's a great idea. I
it's a great idea.
The UK used to have all these great ideas. I mean, the UK practically invented libraries like public lending.
And commons and allotments and things,
And museums.
Where have they all gone?
Yeah. And museums, allotments. Yeah, the Victory Gardens, right?
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great idea, but that's the problem, right? If you have libraries, then that doesn't encourage consumption, and anyone can use it, and then, and when anyone can use it, that means anyone can use it. Yeah. Right, when people say anyone
in a British accent.
Yeah.
I feel like towards the end of our episodes, we kind of just go into a kind of spiral into hysteria with
That's okay.
strange noises and silly voices. It's fine.
Actually,
they forgive us.
When you're reading this book, you gotta take your shirt off.
Can you do Trump, by the way?
It's let's see, it's 11:15 at night and my son is asleep downstairs, so I don't want to
Okay, well, we can save it for next week if you want.
Let's save it for next time.
Okay.
Look,
we're so
people,
we are
people reading books. No, that's terrible. That was like a George Bush Senior. No, I think we have
It's
to.
kind of at the back of your mouth, isn't it? It's like it kind of
People.
I'm not going to attempt it.
Yeah, no, no, it's too late. It's too late. We're over an hour and 20 minutes, and we're not. I think we're done. Yeah.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. So, thank you very much, Will. I'm Lloyd.
And I'm Will, and it's been a pleasure.
And it's been Two Bros, One Book, episode 2. And the book, once again, is Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism by George Manbiot.
Now, before I finish, let me just say, I did not come here to show out, did not come here to impress you. Because to tell you the truth, when I leave here, I'm gone. And I don't care what you think about me, but just remember, when it hits the fan, brother, whether it's next year, 10 years, 20 years from now, you'll never be able to say that these brothers lied to you, Jack.
Thing ain't lie. I done came through the block and everything that's fly. I'm like Che Guevara with bling on. I'm complex. I never claim to have wings on. Nigga, I get my by any means on. Whenever there's a drought, get your umbrellas out because that's when I brainstorm. You can blame Sean, but I ain't invented the game. I just rolled the dice trying to get some change. And I do it twice, ain't no sense in me lying as if I am a different man. And I could blame my environment, but ain't no reason why I be buying expensive chains.